Hello everyone, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at some misconceptions with radar in command. The purpose of this one here is to kind of answer a couple questions that have come up in not too long ago. People going, well, in the flight simulator it does this, or one of those kind of things, and it just thought we could kind of take a look at some of that as well with a kind of basic description. So what do we have here today? Basically, we have, we're sitting up here, and this is basically western China, right on the border of Mongolia, and we have a couple different demonstration aircraft for the purposes of kind of checking things out for us today. In the middle of all this, of course, is a Barlock radar. This is a P-37, sorry. This would actually be an R-37, but that's all right. And basically what we're going to do is take a look at a couple different scenarios and kind of see how things get changed. So first things first, I'm going to go ahead and fire up our simulation here. I'll give this radar a moment to acquire all the fun targets I've created out there. And that looks pretty good. So first things first, when it comes to radars, and this is again one of those things that people are familiar with, but they never really think it through, you always want to be thinking about line of sight of that radar. There are some radars that have the capability of bouncing as radar beam off basically the troposphere and then come back down, but for the most part, all radars need line of sight in order to see a target. If you take a look way over here, I'll go ahead and give us just a moment to identify these targets. Should only take a second here. By the way, if you're curious why it takes time to reset it, it's because this radar is physically rotating, and it takes a while before it can come all the way around and actually identify things. Perfect. So the first thing we've identified is a MiG-21, and it's at medium altitude, about 12,000 feet. The next one we've identified is another aircraft. This is MiG-21 at the same range at 36,000 feet. Since there is line of sight to those two targets, obviously we can detect them. What you don't see is there is a third MiG-21 here at 400 feet. There are just too many mountains and nastiness between here and where the radar is located to be able to actually see this, again, with line of sight. Another common misconception is the concept of Doppler Shift. So what I have here is I actually have two different helicopters, or identical helicopters. One's a Mi-24V, again, it's just sitting here, perfectly parked, no speed change whatsoever. And it is detectable by our P-37 radar, even though it is just sitting there hovering in the air. Our second one has a very, very little Doppler shift. Again, Doppler shift is basically a change in speed. Most radars use Doppler shifts in order to filter out noise. We'll actually take a look at a demonstration of that in a minute. So you can see, even though this one's only doing 20 knots, we are still able to detect it. Again, this is a very common thing that you'll see in flight sims, where if you move slow enough, you basically cannot be detected or reliably engaged, especially if there's a bunch of noise behind you, which we do actually have some mountain ranges here. And you can see in this case, even though this is a relatively old radar system, that Doppler shift doesn't solve our problem. Now, there's another part to this too, and that's going to be reflectivity. Let me go ahead and unpause for a second here. I'm going to go ahead and get things going again. Pause. Okay, lovely. You'll notice that we have this MiG-21 out here who's a long distance away. By long, you can take a look, it's almost 210 nautical miles away. And he is flying at a 90 degree to the radar system. So I'll go ahead and speed up time a little bit here. Okay, awesome. And now you'll notice a new target just appeared. As a matter of fact, I'll give it just a moment to identify it. Perfect. You notice that this target was detected at about 217 nautical miles. You'll notice that this target, which is an identical airplane at an identical speed and an identical altitude, wasn't detected until it got to about 204 nautical miles. We can actually confirm that real quick. Yeah, perfect. The reason for that is because of the fact that that particular aircraft has a smaller radar cross-section at that altitude. A lot of people don't believe me when we have things like that, but believe it or not, pointing at the radar you're trying to hide from is one of the best ways to not be seen by it on account of the fact that you take up a smaller radar cross-section. Now, if it was a pure Doppler radar pointing right at it, would be the last thing you'd want to do because it would be able to detect that speed difference between you and it and identify you even through any sort of clutter. It's just a common misconception. Another misconception that a lot of people have, and this is one of those things where people just do not believe me in the slightest until they see it for themselves, is the concept of stealth. We had a whole video basically dedicated to this, and we kind of talked about the different techniques and stuff, but it's kind of worth reminding here for just demonstration purposes. So we'll give it just a moment. Just a moment. I don't want to speed it up too much because then we're going to miss the fun. Pause. This is an F-117. And you notice that it has a range of about 37 nautical miles, and we had no difficulty in the slightest with this old-style radar. Again, it's a bar lock. If you want to take a look at its details real quick, you can see it's actually early 1960s technology. Had no difficulty in detecting this F-117 that was literally flying right up to it. And we're not talking a visual detection. This was an electronic detection. Now, the reason for that is usually stealth aircraft have other things going on for them, such as jamming, clutter, any of those things that make it more difficult to detect. And again, I did a whole video dedicated to it. But some people don't realize that certain wavelengths, especially from an older radar that's an early warning radar, notice it's an E and F band, actually have an easier time detecting stealth aircraft than more modern radars working on higher frequency bands. Again, it's just a simple misconception that people forget about. Which brings us to our next point. Let's go ahead and grab this one more time. We'll go ahead and get blue side. Okay. Another one that people commonly think of is the concept of hiding at different altitudes in order to avoid detection. So what I have here is I have a group of MiG-23s. These are the ML versions. They're all sitting there. I've got all the radars, and I have a MiG-21 over here on the left. What they're going to do is they're going to be flying this way, and they're going to attempt to detect 4 different targets. The topmost target, of course, is at high altitude, same altitude. This one's at medium altitude, so we've got about 12, 11,000 foot difference. And of course, we have one skimming barely over the ground doing about 400 feet. This one over here is just at 12,000 feet. It's just going to be demonstrating the effect of this. So these are MiG-23s. So MiG-23s don't have the world's best radar. They don't have the world's worst radar. If you actually come in here, it's a Sapphire 23ML version. It's late 1970s technology. It does have what they call look down, shoot down capability. What does that mean? That means because of it using Doppler shifting technology, it should be able to see targets that are below it that can potentially be lost in ground clutter. So I'm going to go ahead and speed up time a little bit and see if that ground clutter helps us at all, even though this is old 70s technology. Give it just a moment, pause. You'll notice it had no impact whatsoever because this technology is good enough to filter out any targets that are approaching it. On the flip side, our MiG-21 BIS over here has not detected its target that's at medium altitude because it does not have that capability to look down. As a matter of fact, it just flew over the top of that target and never ever once saw it because it didn't have the ability to look down. Now, if my MiG-21 were at a lower altitude than that other MiG-23 that was coming at us, we'd still be able to detect it. This is an issue in usually Cold War scenarios more so than you're going to see in modern scenarios. But generally, don't think that just because you can go at a lower altitude that you can hide in ground clutter. And again, we'll take a look at ground clutter in a minute in a rather dramatic fashion. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the final thing that people commonly kind of look at things a little differently here. I'm actually going to switch teams. So what I have way over here is I have an F-4 Phantom E. He's got his radar turned in. Directly in front of us are going to be 3 different targets. One's going to be a crossing, one's going to be a receding, and one's going to be approaching. These are all really good Doppler-style targets because the speed differences are going to be rather dramatic. Perfect. So now you can see very clearly that one is crossing us, which should theoretically get notched. Notch simply means that our filters built into the radar won't see him because he's moving basically at no speed relative to us. This one should be very challenging to detect because it's moving basically the exact same speed as us. So again, there's not going to be much of a shift there. And of course, this one approaching us would be very easy to detect because it's at the same altitude, no clutter, anything like that. So let's go ahead in a shut-off God view here. Go ahead and make all these go away. And let's go ahead and unpause and see what happens. Pause. Notice we had no difficulty in the slightest detecting those 3 targets, despite them being all in their own little different filter zones. Again, folks who are familiar with flight simulators have seen this in action and had a really tough time trying to detect especially this target and especially this target. But it's just worth seeing that in command because of the way the radar is modeled, that might not go down. So that classic technique actually does not apply here, which is, again, very interesting. Now, what about jamming targets? Now, jamming targets is kind of its own thing here. Now, what I actually have here is I have this nice little Tupolev 16P, and of course, for those of you, again, going back to your flight sim folks, so you're very familiar with what jammers look like in the games. Basically, they're going to flood you with all sorts of noise. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and flip on this jamming here. And I'm going to go ahead and unpause. I'll go ahead and switch back to the other team, and let's see what that jamming looks like. So the first thing happens is we lose sight of this target immediately, because visually on the display of this particular guy, he's seeing basically vertical lines where he should be seeing any sort of targets. Now this particular target is now completely invisible to this radar. It can simply not be detected because that noise is so strong. Remember though, the closer this jammer gets to that radar, the easier it is to burn through the actual view of that radar. So it actually becomes possible to detect it, even though it shouldn't be something you can do. Now, hopefully all this is kind of making a little bit of sense. Some of it shouldn't be surprising, but it's just kind of worthwhile to take the time to actually demonstrate it. And to demonstrate it even further, I pulled out a really, really cool program for those of you who've never had a chance to play with this called SamSim. And what this does is this gives us the ability to actually model what these radar sites are actually experiencing when they're using these particular sites. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and unpause real quick. We're sitting in an SA2 here in case you're curious particular which version this is. And basically I'm going to quickly go over here. I'm going to go ahead and flip on my transmitter, make sure everything's working. And this would be what we would see if we were looking through the basically your search radar. Right now we have a target directly to the south. We can go ahead and switch to maximum range, but you'll notice there's absolutely zero noise here because this particular radar only detects objects based on speed differences. So if there's no speed differences, you're completely invisible to me. Now contrast this with my regular fire control radar, which is basically a pulse style. Remember, since we're on the ground, we don't have to worry about looking down. But you'll notice if I go ahead and change the elevation of the radar, you start getting all these funky little lines and stuff like that starting to appear directly there. This is all going to be ground clutter. As a matter of fact, I'm going to spin us around here. Just point in the general direction of the target and see if we can actually find that target. So now the cool thing is we have these beautiful plotting boards. Like I can see for the fact that my target is right here at 180. So now I can go ahead and take my radar, point it right about 180. And hypothetically, I should be able to see the target somewhere here. I'll go ahead and try a slightly higher elevation. I'll try a slightly lower elevation, trying to visually see that target, but I'm having a heck of a time actually identifying where it is out there. The reason for this is my target that I'm actually looking for is actually really, really low altitude. So as a result, it's very, very difficult. There he is. See him? So this is actually what I would see. Yeah, that's all I get to see. I actually can't lock onto him because if I tried to move the radar down any lower, I'd actually bottom the radar out. Now, let's say he was flying through some of this nasty clutter right here. How could I actually still see him? Well, you can actually filter the clutter out by getting rid of any speed changes. I could come over here and hit this, and now it makes it very, very clear who is a target and who is clutter. But you can see in just a moment, yep, did you see him drop out? Because now he's behind this piece of hill. I won't be able to see him again until he crosses over the hill and starts coming down this way, even though I'm still filtering him out directly. So again, it's very, very interesting. And you can kind of see that even though that's a problem, and even though this is old technology, you can actually still see through all of that and actually get pretty far with it. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out real quick, because I want to show you what the jamming looks like real fast. So again, everything can kind of get reinforced. We'll take ourselves up to Hungary. We'll go ahead and pick a site that's nice and open, so I have plenty of room to see. We'll go ahead and add that same target one more time. This is called SAM Simulator, by the way, for those of you who have never seen this one before. Give it just a moment, because probably is running off the other drive. That looks pretty good. Put him right here, and I'm actually going to turn on jamming as well. Let's see what happens this time. Go ahead and start it again. All right, looks pretty good. I'm going to turn everything on, turn on my receiver, and I'm not going to energize my radar. Now, you're probably going, what are you doing here? What's your point? Well, let me show you. So this is going back to our search radar. Remember when I said that when you get jammed, you could see it very distinctively? There it is. Now, tell me where exactly I'm supposed to be able to find a target in that giant wall of noise. Now, keep in mind, my search radar is separate from my regular attack fire control radar. Okay, let's go look at my fire control radar. So that was roughly the south of us. So I'm going to go ahead and spin my radar around. Remember, my transmitter is not turned on. Watch this. There it is. All this is all what that jamming looks like to me. Notice, I can still see targets on either side of the jamming, no problem. But watch what happens when I turn my radar into it. Bam. So now I can't actually see the target through any of these lines. Now, if I were to go flip on my transmitter again real quick, just for fun, you could see that not only have I got the noise, but look at this. How am I supposed to track a target through that? The reality is I can actually burn through that jamming if I give myself enough time. I can actually I have special instruments on board. Again, this is old technology, but it still works good enough to enable me to go ahead and try to lock onto this guy. Right now, I'm having a really tough time because he's so low to the ground, but I'm going to go ahead and use some electronic means to go ahead and actually tilt the radar down electronically. And I'm almost able to lock onto the jamming itself. There we go. Cool. So we've actually locked onto both the jamming as well as the object, but there's no object to lock onto. All I'm doing right now is pointing the radar at the jamming. Now, again, if I go over here and were to shut off my transmitter, I can still lock onto that target because there's still noise. But we're trying to demonstrate burn through, so we're going to go ahead and flip my radar back on for this purpose. I'm going to go ahead and change modes real quick. That looks pretty good right there. Good. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to speed up time a little bit. And we're going to see if we can ever see that target through that jamming. So keep in mind, if I go to my plotting board, go ahead and put it to a normal speed here real fast, you can see that the particular target that I'm tracking is getting extremely close. As a matter of fact, it's right about to cross over our heads if we give it any time. Right now, it's actually passing to the side of us. But notice, at no point have I ever been able to actually see the target itself. Switch modes real quickly here. Okay, looks pretty good. No, it's not going to help us today. Nope. And you can see we never actually can see that target directly. So we'll pop back over to command real quick. And you can imagine now, if this guy's looking at that, he's seeing the same thing I was looking at a moment ago. All right, hopefully this video kind of answers some of those questions about the misconceptions. That program over there was SAM Simulator. It is free. It's kind of fun to play with if you ever wanted to see it from the other perspective. Some of you are probably going, some of these things seem a little unrealistic or not quite what you expect. But again, it's a pretty complex simulation and it does a pretty good job. It's just a matter of understanding kind of how that's modeled so that when you start developing tactics, you recognize that things may work a little bit better than you thought they did. Enjoy.